What happens to a life built on other people's applause when the applause stops? What happens when a man wakes to a quiet house and discovers that every feeling, every fear, every triumph, every small, sharp ache is his alone to carry? This is the question that sits like weight in the chest of the man you will meet, and in the space between that weight and the answer lives a kind of work most men never sign up for until the moment they have no choice. You see him first in a small, ordinary scene, a chipped mug on the windowsill, steam thinning into winter light. The city is beginning its mechanical hum below. The apartment is still. He loosens the collar of his shirt, not because it's tight, but because it is easier to breathe without pretending. There is a list in the pocket of his coat, errands, messages, people who expect things of him. And beneath the list, a longer, softer addendum he keeps to himself, the feelings he will not say aloud, regret about a conversation he didn't have, anxiety about money he didn't make, a small, persistent sadness over a friendship that cooled without explanation. At first, those things are background noise. He is organized enough, disciplined enough, to show up and perform. He earns approval, promotions, compliments, the easy smile that comes when he knows what to do. But the applause has always been external, a scoreboard controlled by others. When the noise fades, a peculiar truth reveals itself. He has been practicing for everyone else's life, not his own. What happens when the scaffolding of external validation is removed is not dramatic at first. It shows up as missed opportunities, not the grand kind, but the small erosions that rearrange a life. He stops calling an old friend because the call would not be admired by his circle. He postpones a hobby because it won't make him look productive. He accepts a role at work that fits the expectations laid out for him because risk isn't applauded in his environment. He learns to measure himself in likes and nods, and over time, the map of who he is shrinks to the size of what others reward. This book begins there, in that quiet room, with the man taking the mug to the sink and deciding, quietly, to change something, not because someone demanded it, but because something in him has tired of being a functionary in the theater of other people's lives. He looks at the fogged window and asks a very simple question. If I feel everything alone, how do I stop being undone by it? There are no grand revelations in what follows, only steady work. The first part of that work is a reorientation toward responsibility, not blame, not harsh self-condemnation, but the sober act of taking possession of the things you can influence. Responsibility is not accepting guilt for everything. It is recognizing the space where your action matters.
When you stop handing away power, stopping the habit of waiting for a savior, a partner, a leader, or an audience to tell you you are enough, you begin to rebuild agency. He starts small. The first thing he does is to stop telling himself the story that rescue will come from another person. That's not cynicism, it's clarity. He writes down one area where he has been passive and commits a simple action. If he has been waiting for someone to call about a job, he sends one application today. If he's waiting for a relationship to change without saying anything, he speaks one truth, not to punish, but to be honest. These are not heroic acts. They are modest, methodical, almost boring. Yet boring things, done daily, accumulate into character. What this looks like in practice, a morning 5-minute check-in. Not a vow, not a manifesto, but a small accounting. Sit, take the breath, ask 2 questions. What do I own today? What do I release? Ownership might be as concrete as a calendar item, a bill to pay, a promise to return an email. Release might be the expectation that someone else will perform what only you can do. It is a practice that rewires you from expecting rescue to making decisions. Micro-challenge. Tonight, before bed, write down one area where you have been waiting for someone else to act, and name the single smallest step you can take tomorrow. Reflection. After you do that step, notice what you learned. How did it feel to move rather than wait? On the heels of taking responsibility comes the second orientation, the internal scorecard. The external scoreboard, likes, promotions, applause, is unreliable,
because it measures the wrong things. An internal scorecard is a private ledger where you track what you control: effort, integrity, and process. It is not about avoiding compliments. It is about placing the center of gravity inside your own decisions. Imagine a small, worn notebook in his back pocket. He opens it over coffee, the page curled at the corners. He writes 3 lines, one about his effort, one about one truth he told that day, one about something he resisted that would have led to an easy short-term gain but compromised him. Some days the page reads thin, other days the ink is heavy with small victories. Over months, the pages become a record not of success or failure, but of a person practicing alignment. The internal scorecard changes the question from "Did I look good?" to "Did I act according to my values?" If your values are clear and non-negotiable, defined by you, not by a marketable image, then small, repeated acts of alignment create a momentum that is quieter but more durable than applause. It eliminates the need to ask permission for your dignity. Micro-challenge. Tonight, create a 1-page internal scorecard. List 3 criteria you will use to evaluate your day for the next week. For example, did I show up? Did I choose honesty? Did I rest enough?
Reflection. At the end of the week, review the pages. What patterns do you notice? Which criterion was easiest to keep? Which required more courage? The third piece of early work is mastering self-motivation, becoming a thermostat instead of a thermometer. A thermometer measures. It reflects the temperature of its environment. A thermostat sets one. Most people tilt toward thermometers. Their energy rises with approval and falls with criticism. A thermostat creates its own baseline by designing practices and rituals that generate consistent energy. This is not about pretending to be invulnerable. It's about building reliable sources of momentum. He builds 3 small rituals: a morning ritual, simple movements, a splash of cold water, a brief read that creates an honest threshold before the day begins; an afternoon checkpoint, a 2-minute note in the internal scorecard to reset intentions; an evening recovery routine, dim lights, a deliberate disconnect from screens, a short gratitude list. Each ritual functions independently. They are private systems that do not require an audience. They do not promise to fix everything, but they create an internal climate where choices can be made deliberately. There is a practical reason for this posture beyond sentiment. When a setback arrives, rituals cushion the reactivity. If your baseline is a series of small, self-created rituals, you are less vulnerable to emotional storms. You are not sealed off from feeling. Instead, you are anchored to a rhythm that helps you respond rather than merely react. Micro-challenge. Design one 60-second morning ritual you can repeat for 7 days. Reflection. After each day, jot 1 line. Today, this ritual did X for me. Notice the cumulative effect. After these first moves, ownership, an internal ledger, thermostat practices, there is an early shift. Not a transformation, not an arrival, but a change in posture. The man who once waited for external applause begins to find sources of motion that are his alone. That shift is fragile because it is quiet and easy to ignore. It is also vulnerable because the old habits are reinforced socially. Friends who enjoyed his performance may find him less entertaining. Colleagues may misinterpret his steadiness as distance. That is part of the cost of stepping away from applause. But the greater cost, when you keep seeking validation, is the life of small concessions until you no longer recognize your own aims. If this threading of practice and meaning resonates with you, stay with it. There are practical worksheets and a brief companion guide that can help you track the internal scorecard and design rituals. If you want to continue, make the commitment to listen through the next sections, where we move into how to feel without being controlled by feeling, and how to establish private systems that defend your inner climate in the face of real stress.
You will notice I offered a small encouragement there, a simple invitation to continue. That is the only ask you will find in this first long stretch. The work is the real ask, to try a practice, to keep a page, to answer a question honestly. From here, the terrain grows steeper. The next lesson is emotional independence, which is the ability to feel without being mastered by the feeling. This is not stoic repression. It is a posture of wise engagement, feeling fully, naming what is happening, and choosing actions that honor both the emotion and your long-term standards. The danger in feeling everything alone is not feeling,
It is being governed by feelings you have no tools to interpret. He learns a simple protocol for emotional first aid. When a strong emotion arrives, fury, humiliation, grief, he does 3 things: name it, measure its urgency, and regulate the immediate impulse. Naming converts raw intensity into an object you can inspect. Saying, "This is anger," or "This is disappointment," immediately creates space. Measuring urgency is a quick cognitive question. Is this urgent action required now, or can it be processed in time? Regulation is a short, self-created step. Breathe, reposition, delay the immediate response that might cause harm or regret. There are basic techniques attached to the protocol that are practical and human. He practices a self-soothing script when the chest tightens. Feel the shoulders drop. Slow the inhale. Count to 4 on the exhale. He puts his journal beside him and writes a sentence. "I am feeling X because of Y." The sentence often reveals motive and removes a part of the weight. He also has a rule about communication. If the emotion is heated, he waits before responding. He sets a boundary with himself. No major conversations in the first hour after intense activation. At this point, a necessary caution. Some feelings are not simply upsetting. They can be symptoms of deep clinical issues like persistent depression or anxiety that interferes with basic functioning. If your emotions are overwhelming, relentless, or make daily activities impossible, consider speaking to a licensed professional, a therapist, counselor, or doctor. Emotional independence is a practice, not a cure-all, and professionals are part of the support system that makes sustainable independence possible. Micro-challenge. The next time you notice a strong emotion, use the 3-step protocol. Name it, measure its urgency, regulate the impulse. Spend 30 seconds writing 1 sentence explaining what might have triggered it. Reflection. After an hour, read the sentence. How did the impulse to respond change? Parallel to emotional independence comes the building of private systems. Private systems are the infrastructure you create for yourself. Routines, trackers, recovery protocols that work no matter what people think. They are the scaffolding of a life that functions when external supports fall away.
Unlike grand plans that require applause or others' involvement, private systems are modular. If one node fails, another supports you. He designs a morning ritual not for show, but because he wants a foundation for the day. He creates a simple recovery plan for nights when sleep is fractured, a wind-down window, a brief mobility routine, blue light discipline. He uses a tracker for behaviors he wants to make habitual, 20 minutes of focused work, 2 strength exercises, 1 meaningful conversation. The tracker is not punitive, it is informative. One of its hidden powers is that it translates abstract intentions into measurable acts. When you see a line of recorded days, you begin to trust your capacity. Private systems also include redundancy. For example, financial buffers are not a promise of full protection. They are a pragmatic cushion to prevent panic. Emotional buffers might be a list of trusted people and 3 non-urgent ways to reach them. Social buffers include scheduled weekly contact with one friend, whether or not the contact yields immediate gratification. The goal of redundancy is not to isolate, it is to create a base from which generosity is possible, even in scarcity. Micro-challenge. Create a 1-page private systems checklist. Pick 3 daily anchors you will do for 7 days. For example, water bottle by your desk, 10 minutes of movement, 1 paragraph in your journal. Reflection. At the end of the week, note which anchors stuck and which fell away. What made the difference? Trusting your own judgment follows naturally from the practice of small commitments in private systems. When you make a decision and follow through on the small consequences, you gather data for bigger decisions. The man learns to start small. A small financial choice, a short conversation he has been postponing, a decision about saying no. Each small act of judgment builds a quiet currency of experience. He adopts a simple decision framework to keep himself from oscillating. Identify the essential criteria, values, impact, time horizon, set a reasonable deadline for the decision, and take the smallest move that tests the assumption. The framework reduces the noise of options and prevents paralysis by perfection. It is not a denial of uncertainty, it is a humble way to learn. Micro-challenge. Pick 1 small decision you've been avoiding. Apply the 3-step framework. Define criteria, set a deadline within 72 hours, make the smallest test move. Reflection. After the move, what did you learn? How did your stomach feel?
Where did your confidence adjust? There is an inevitable crossroads here. If you keep trying these small practices, you will encounter resistance, both internal and external. Internal resistance arrives as the old stories. You are a certain kind of person. You are unchangeable. External resistance can be subtler. Friends who liked the old version of you. Colleagues who prefer your prior reactivity.
The man meets resistance in a form many men know, the uneasy silence of people who expected him to remain the same performer. When resistance shows up, a new habit helps. Stop seeking approval and begin conserving energy. Approval seeking is an energy tax. It demands your best emotional bandwidth for an outcome you don't fully control. The alternative is to adopt a policy of selective sharing. Not everyone needs your reasoning. Not every choice requires explanation. He practices a short rule. Ask himself whether sharing will improve the outcome for others or simply relieve his own need for validation. If the answer is the latter, he holds the reasoning close and trusts his internal scorecard to evaluate the decision. That is not a call to secrecy. It is a call to economy. When you are selective about where to expend your energy, you have more capacity for the places that matter. He notices that when he stops over-explaining, people respond differently, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with curiosity, often with respect. Paradoxically, the less he explains, the more present he becomes to the things that matter. Micro-challenge. The next time someone asks why, pause and answer with one sentence that focuses on the outcome, not the justification. Reflection. Did you feel relief? Did the listener react differently than you expected? As he moves into solitude, the next kind of practice, the man learns a critical distinction. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is suffered. Solitude is an intentional space for clarity building. Loneliness is an unmet social need. The difference matters because the remedies differ. Solitude strengthens you. Loneliness requires connection. You can choose solitude without rejecting friendship. You can cultivate the muscles to be alone without falling into isolation. Solitude is practiced like any skill. He starts with short, intentional windows, 10 minutes before bed with a notebook, a solo walk, no phone, an hour a week to pursue a project that has nothing to do with productivity metrics. These small acts teach him to listen to himself. In the quiet, he discovers impulses that previously were drowned out by the expectation of an audience. Solitude also becomes a laboratory for testing the internal scorecard. Without the external signals, you have to decide whether your values still matter to you, not to others. In these moments, the man writes more honestly, listens more carefully, and rests more deeply. Micro-challenge. Schedule a 30-minute solitude window this week. During it, turn phones off and write one page about what you want less of and one page about what you want more of. Reflection. After the window, note one action you can take in the next 48 hours that aligns with what you discovered. As the narrative moves, the man's practices build a fragile competence. He is not yet unshakable. He still carries hurts and anxieties, and those will remain human.
But each practice gives him a new response option. He is learning not to be mastered by feeling, to measure his life by internal criteria, to craft a private scaffolding that preserves his ability to act. It is in this phase, on a rain-skinned evening in late autumn, that a complication arrives. The man gets a call that unsettles him in a way procedural challenges have not prepared him for. It is not a catastrophe that will end his life. It is the kind that tests whether the systems he has built are sufficiently redundant. The caller speaks in the soft, technical voice of consequences. A project delayed, a contract pulled, a relationship misread. For a moment, the old reflex returns. Look for the audience. Seek the outside verdict. For one fraught breath, he is the thermometer, sensitive to the room's temperature. But something else occurs. Before deciding in panic, he reaches, almost automatically, for the worn notebook in his jacket. The internal scorecard is there, the lines of small decisions he has made. He flips. The pages whisper back a history of tiny commitments kept. He reads entries from the morning ritual, the sentence he wrote after the first honest conversation, a line about a week he had deliberately avoided alcohol to test a hypothesis about his energy. The notebook does not eliminate the fact of the call. It simply provides context, a ledger that shows pattern rather than panic. He sits. He breathes the three-part emotional protocol. He names the sensation, disappointment, anxiety, a spear of shame, and measures its urgency. He decides not to respond to the call with a defensive email. He drafts a short, factual reply and lets it sit. He calls one person on his list,
not to unload, but to ask a practical question about options. He returns to his private systems, the sleep routine, the redundancy plan, a small financial line item that can rearrange the coming weeks. He chooses the smallest, most testable action that advances him forward. For a reader, that moment may look humble. For the man in the story, it is catalytic. The systems were not designed to avoid every setback. They were designed to make measured, non-frenzied responses possible. He acts from a center that has been cultivated. He still feels the ache, but he is not broken by it. At the end of that night, he writes a long entry. It is not triumphant. It is grateful in a careful way, grateful for the small scaffolds that prevented a collapse. He writes a line that will matter later. I could have panicked and made things worse. Instead, I practiced what I had practiced in quiet. And here, in this turning place, there is room. There is a chance to pause the story and consider what is next. How to refine that inner architecture so it holds under trial. How to make decisions that build credibility rather than dependence. And how to turn criticism into fuel rather than a poison.
The work ahead is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about forming reliable habits that let you meet vulnerability without losing yourself. Micro-challenge. Tonight, write 5 lines in your internal scorecard about a setback you currently face. For each line, note one practical step you can take in the next 72 hours that tests an assumption rather than postponing action. Reflection. Which of those steps feels most doable? Start there. You have been with him through the beginning of a quiet transformation. He has begun to disassemble old dependencies and to assemble a private life that can hold him. The tests are coming because life does not wait for readiness. The next segment will deepen the tools, how to filter feedback, how to make criticism usable, how to set standards that outlast moods, and how, paradoxically, building solitude can make you more available to others. But for now, the man sits with his notebook. Outside, the rain eases into a hush. He is not whole, he is beginning. He has felt everything alone and found that feeling alone does not have to mean being crushed by it. It can mean learning, step by small step, how to create a life that runs on the power you generate within, whether or not anyone is watching. He spends the next weeks not in dramatic overhaul, but in patient refinement. The notebook stays in his pocket like an old talisman, worn at the spine, pages soft with repeated thumbs. The lessons so far, responsibility, the internal scorecard, thermostat habits, emotional first aid, private systems, small decisions, are not finished. They are ongoing disciplines that demand repetition, testing, and occasional repair. The arc now bends towards subtler work, learning to convert criticism into fuel, tightening standards into a form of mercy, practicing tiny acts of self-reliance until they compound into a character that can withstand real storms. One evening, after a week of small wins and a few relapses, he opens a new page and writes a question. What do I do when people aim their dissatisfaction at me? It is not hypothetical. By then, the world has given him a dozen small barbs, an old friend's sharp remark about his choices, a boss's curt email, a social post that reduces nuance to insult. For someone who used to live or die by applause, the sting of criticism could reopen old habits, defensiveness, frantic explanation, the urge to take the measure of his worth from the mirror of opinion. The turning point is not to harden or to ignore feedback indiscriminately. It is to learn a practical filter. He divides outside voices into 3 categories, and the division is simple and pragmatic: source, signal, and motive. Source asks, who is speaking, and what is their relation to the matter? Signal asks, what truth, if any, is present in the message? Motive asks, why is this person saying it? Are they informed, resentful, projecting, curious? The filter is not moralizing. It is economic. Not every piece of criticism deserves his capital, his attention, his energy, his response. He practices by reading a negative email aloud in a neutral voice, and then speaking the 3 filter questions to himself. Often the first pass strips away heat. The motivated person's bitterness is easier to set aside. The curious critic's observation is a gift. Sometimes nothing useful survives the filter, and the insult evaporates into the room. Sometimes a small, useful point emerges that becomes the next testable assumption. He records the useful scrap in the margin of the internal scorecard,
and plans one tiny experiment. Reply with curiosity, adjust a habit, or leave the comment unaddressed and monitor outcomes. Turning criticism into fuel requires two complementary practices: extraction and boundary setting. Extraction is the discipline of finding the useful atom inside the complaint, one testable nugget you can try for a week. Boundary setting is the discipline of refusing to let the complaint determine your mood or derail your day. You make the choice: use the information or ignore the noise. Either way, keep control of the ledger. Micro-challenge. The next time you receive criticism that triggers you, apply the 3-filter test. Identify source, extract signal, ask motive. Choose one tiny experiment you can run for 7 days to test whether there is truth in the signal. Reflection. After 3 days, write what changed. Was the criticism a doorway or a distraction? The man notices immediate relief from the practice. He spends less time composing defenses in his head. He answers fewer emails in the heat of the moment. He is not immune to pained reactions. There are still nights when barbed words echo, but he is less inclined to let those echoes dictate his next action. In place of reactivity, the internal scorecard now records intention. The ledger keeps the story. Alongside learning how to use criticism, he tightens his standards. Standards are not a tyrant's rule. They are a map of who you intend to be in ordinary moments. They are different from goals. Goals are outcomes. Finish this project. Earn this promotion. Standards are practices that guide choices long before outcomes materialize. Integrity in small transactions. Patience in conversation. Clarity in commitments. Where goals can swing with fortune, standards are a horizon you row toward every morning. He drafts a short list of non-negotiables. They are modest and concrete. Speak truth within 48 hours to people who matter. Honor sleep by keeping a consistent wind-down window. Respond to urgent messages within 1 work hour when they bear on team responsibilities. And refrain from major decisions in the first 12 hours after intense emotional activation. Each standard maps to a value: honesty, health, reliability, temperance. He pins those standards not to the public wall, but to the inner ledger. They become measuring sticks on the internal scorecard. Standards also function as mercy. When you set a clear bar for yourself, you reduce the daily load of weighing every choice anew. The man discovers this in the small mercies. He does not have to negotiate his integrity every time someone offers a shortcut. He walks past some temptations, not out of moral preening, but because a line is drawn and the choice is easy. This economy of attention leaves more bandwidth for real challenges. Micro-challenge. Write 3 personal standards you will keep for the next 30 days. Make them specific and measurable. Not be better, but sleep by 11 p.m. on weeknights. Reflection. After a week, which standard felt hardest? Why? Adjust wording if needed so it is actionable. There is another discipline that grows quietly in this season: the daily practice of small self-reliance tasks. These are not grand gestures. They are the micro-habits that, repeated, prove you can count on yourself. Make your bed. Pay the bill on the day it's due. Prepare a simple lunch at home. Respond to a message with a brief truth rather than long justification. Each act, by itself, feels trivial. Together, they form a backbone. He builds a checklist on his phone that is almost absurd in its simplicity. Hydrate, 10 minutes of mobility, 1 paragraph of uninterrupted work, 1 kind message to a friend, journal line in the evening. The checklist is not punitive. It is a visible string of compounding competence. On bad days, the line is short. On good days, it is longer. The key is to show up to a minimum standard, even when you don't feel like it. That is the muscle of reliability. Micro-challenge. For the next 7 mornings, perform a 5-minute task that you can complete before your phone is checked. Make your bed. Drink 16 ounces of water, or stretch. Reflection. What did starting the morning with 1 small win do to your sense of capability? As the weeks fold into months, there are invitations to test these habits publicly. A colleague proposes a risky joint venture. An estranged friend suggests reconciling with conditions that make the man uneasy. Each invitation measures the growth of the inner ledger. He consults his standards, weighs the private systems available, and chooses the smallest test that protects both his values and the relationship. Sometimes no is the correct choice,
and he learns to say it clearly and without over-explaining. Sometimes the test is yes, but with a short, bounded pilot phase. Refusal becomes a practiced, non-dramatic thing. It is not rejection as weapon, it is refusal as preservation. The man discovers that saying no often clarifies the offerings of his life and attracts people who respect limits. That paradox underscores much of what has shifted in him. The less he performs to please, the more people treat him as a person rather than an instrument. Micro-challenge. Identify one request this week you can decline without harm. Practice saying no in one sentence, focusing on the outcome rather than the reasons.
Reflection. Note how it felt to refuse. What assumptions did you have about the consequences, and how did reality compare? Inevitably, a deeper trial emerges, one that will test not just habits, but identity. An unexpected betrayal surfaces. The man learns that a close collaborator misrepresented their work in a way that threatens both reputation and livelihood. It is not dramatic in a cinematic sense, no police, no headline, but it has teeth. The man feels the old primal reactions: heat, a racing mind, the urge for public correction. The sabotage pierces his trust and demands a response. This is the kind of moment all those small disciplines had been preparing for. He does not pretend to be unaffected. He takes the evening and sits with his breathing protocol. He names the bundle of emotions: humiliation, anger, the sharp grief of violated expectation, and measures urgency. Is immediate public rebuttal necessary? He runs the situation through the decision framework he has practiced. List essential criteria, set a short deadline for decision, and choose the smallest testable move. The essential criteria include protecting his work, maintaining professional integrity, and minimizing harm to innocents who might be dragged into the dispute. He decides against an immediate scorched earth response. Instead, he drafts a concise, factual message, sets it aside for 12 hours, and then reviews it with one trusted confidant on his list, someone who asks practical questions rather than stoke feelings. He gathers documentation, organizes a calm, factual response, and plans next steps that privilege repair and clarity over vengeance. He also uses the episode as data. What in his systems prevented panic? What gaps did the betrayal reveal? He updates the private systems checklist to include clearer documentation practices and a short pre-agreement phase for future collaborations. That night, he writes a long entry in the notebook, not to boast, but to account. The entry notes the impulse, the decision process, and how adhering to standards preserved options. He notices, too, a curious side effect. By choosing a measured course, he maintains dignity. Others notice not because he announced his composure, but because their eyes land on the steadiness that comes from quiet competence. Micro-challenge. When faced with a betrayal or major disappointment, take a 12-hour pause before a public response. Use that time to draft facts, consult one trusted person, and decide the smallest testable step. Reflection. Did the delay improve your outcome? What did you learn about your impulse control? As the story progresses toward the final arcs, the man begins to notice a surprising side of solitude. It has not made him lonelier. It has made him more deliberate in his relationships. He chooses friends not by quantity or convenience, but by the way those relationships reciprocate care and respect his standards.
He becomes someone who calls as much as he is called, who brings practical help rather than performative sympathies. The paradox deepens. The man who learned to feel everything alone is becoming someone people rely upon. This transition is not automatic. There are missteps. He must unlearn two persistent habits: rescuing others to obtain approval, and withholding presence to protect himself from disappointment. The balanced practice is to offer presence governed by boundaries, consistent, practical, and sustainable. He schedules weekly check-ins with a few close friends, but he also ensures those check-ins are not the only source of his emotional steadiness. He practices being present without fusing his worth to another's response. There is a gentle reciprocity that emerges. When a friend loses a parent, he is there, quietly, practically, present. He brings soup, helps coordinate calls, sends short, practical messages. He does not perform grief. He holds space. The friend remarks, months later, that his steadiness was what made the worst days bearable. The man hears the words and realizes that reliability is attractive.
People seek the calm anchor, not because he commands them to, but because he has become someone whose presence reduces chaos. Micro-challenge. In the next week, offer practical help to someone without asking for thanks. Prepare a meal, take a task off their list, or send a simple message of presence. Reflection. How did it feel to give without performing? What did you notice in the other person's response? We come to the more structural pieces now, building a life that functions whether others support you, and designing redundancy. Anyone can write inspirational lines about being self-sufficient. The real work is pragmatic. Build financial buffers, cultivate non-dependent friendships, and create systems that are not brittle. He revisits his finances with the same pragmatic curiosity he applies to habits. He identifies one line item he can cut for 6 months to free up emergency cash, sets up a modest automatic transfer to a small rainy day account, and designs a 30-day plan to reduce friction in expenses. He also maps emotional redundancy, 3 people he can call for 3 different needs: practical advice, emotional containment, and perspective. Redundancy is not a fortress, it is a network. He learns to steward relationships so they are mutual and durable. He schedules a monthly call with an old mentor, a fortnightly run with a peer, and weekly club attendance, simple, low-pressure commitments that maintain connection without dependency. These networks are not designed to replace private systems. They are designed to sit beside them, like a gentle support rig. Micro-challenge. Create a redundancy map. List 3 financial, 3 emotional, and 3 practical buffers you can activate in a crisis. Choose 1 financial and 1 relational item to implement this month. Reflection. Which buffer felt easiest to create?
Which one required more courage? By this stage, the man's notebook is thick with entries: experiments, small results, nights of doubt, mornings of resolve. The internal scorecard has become a living thing. He uses it not to tally virtue, but to gather data. Sometimes the data disproves his hypotheses. He learns to change course. He learns humility. He also learns the secret of sustainable leadership. You can be steady without being static. The narrative arcs toward a final test, not because life is theatrical, but because sensitivity and responsibility invite trials. The climactic scene unfolds some months after the initial betrayal. A close community project falters in a way that threatens many livelihoods. The man is not the project's lead, but his competence has made him a natural point of contact when panic rises. Late on a rain-heavy afternoon, he receives a call from someone he trusts who is near breaking. A critical vendor has pulled out. A small group of people's months of labor teeters. The crisis demands coordination, clear-headed triage, and honest decisions. It is the exact situation where the man's old reflexes, public performance, or frozen in fear, could have ruined everything. Instead, he moves through his practiced set. He breathes, he names his immediate reaction, anxiety, urgency, and measures whether immediate public statements will help. He reaches for the ledger, opens the section labeled Collaboration Protocols, and reads the checklist he developed after the earlier betrayal. He calls 2 people on his redundancy map for immediate practical ideas, drafts a short prioritized action list, and enacts the smallest useful step, a targeted message to the most critical vendor offering a clear solution, not a blame-laden critique. He secures a temporary bridge resource from a network contact, sets up a short, transparent update to stakeholders, and assigns small, contained tasks to capable hands. The crisis does not dissolve instantly. There are sore moments, tense negotiations, and late hours that feel like thin rope walks. But the difference is the man's center. He is not performing composure for applause. He is exercising habits that have become reflexive. Other people follow because competence invites trust. In the weeks after the crisis, the community stabilizes. Many credit his level-headedness. He credits the tiny practices, the morning ritual that keeps him anchored, the internal scorecard that reminds him of priorities, the redundancy map that connects him to practical help. What happens when a man feels everything alone is no longer an open question. In the final scenes, he is not alone in the sense of isolation. He is chosen. People arrive at his door not because he demands it, but because his steady presence has become a resource. The paradox resolves. Independence made him available in a healthier, more generous way. He did not become distant or unfeeling. He became someone who could feel deeply and still be useful. The closing pages of his notebook are not triumphalist meditations. They are lists of what worked, what failed, and the experiments he will continue. He writes a short manifesto to himself. Continue to measure by standards, not applause. Write nightly. Choose solitude intentionally. Keep your scorecard private. Treat criticism as testable data. Build redundancy. And be generous with presence, but within boundaries. Before the story ends, there is one small human moment. At a local gathering, a younger man approaches him, nervous, shy, and says, almost apologetically, "You seem calm. How do you do that?" The man sees in the younger face the old urgent question he once carried, the ache of feeling everything alone. He offers a piece of no-nonsense counsel. Start with the smallest things you can keep. Make a page each night. Be honest in one small conversation. Protect your mornings. The rest follows. He does not hand over a magic formula because none exists. He offers a map for patient work. The younger man listens, grateful and cautious. Later that week, the younger man sends a short message. Tried making a page. Helped. The man puts the message in his phone and smiles, not because of praise, but because he remembers the ladder rungs he climbed and understands how small help repays itself. There is also a quiet, non-romanticized recognition of limits. He knows some days will be heavier. He knows some people will need forms of help beyond what he can offer. If someone shows chronic, overwhelming symptoms, persistent inability to function, thoughts of harming themselves, or prolonged, crippling anxiety, he keeps a steady referral line in the notebook. Professional help is a resource, not a retreat. Independence and generosity coexist with humility about when specialized support is necessary. In the final entry, he writes a short answer to the question that opened everything. What happens when a man feels everything alone? The answer is not a single sentence. It is a series of returns to practice. Feeling everything alone can crush you if you lack tools, but feeling everything alone can also be the raw material of a disciplined life, a life where you learn to name emotions, test assumptions, keep a private ledger of effort, design redundant systems, and practice tiny acts of self-reliance. From there, you become someone who is available to others, not because you depend on them for self-worth, but because you have cultivated the capacity to be present. Micro-challenge, final practice, begin a 7-day internal scorecard. Each evening, write 3 lines, one about effort, one about honesty you practiced that day, and one small next step. Reflection prompt? At the end of the week, look for the thread connecting the entries. What small change repeated? Which habit resisted you? Choose one adjustment for the next 7 days. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the work is incremental and patient.
There is no single heroic act that will resolve everything. There are instead 1,000 small decisions that, repeated, shift how you move through the world. The man in the story did not stop feeling. He learned to steward what he felt. He learned to convert pain into information, to convert criticism into experiment, and to build systems that hold when life demands more than you expect. If this message landed for you, consider taking the 7-day scorecard challenge today. Commit to the nightly page. Try one of the micro-challenges above. And if you find value in the approach, subscribe for more stories and practical tools that meet the interior life with concrete methods. There is no promise of instant fix, only a promise that consistent practice changes how you stand in the face of feeling everything alone. The man returns, sometimes, to the chipped mug on the windowsill. He fills it, watches steam lift into morning light, and breathes. Outside, the city moves and applauds and forgets in equal measure. Inside, he has constructed a small climate he can live in, a climate that accepts sorrow and cultivates steadiness. People begin to seek him, not to complete him, but to anchor themselves beside him. What happens then is not that he stops feeling. It is that feeling becomes the source of action rather than the maker of reaction. He becomes a quiet center in a noisy world, responsible without being rigid, generous without being drained, available without needing validation. That is the answer to the question. Feeling everything alone need not equate to breaking. It can be the raw material for becoming someone who stands and then holds others, because he has learned to stand on his own.